Just joining online, we'll be beginning in a couple of minutes. And great. So we'll probably begin. You have those muted? Great. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a Thursday afternoon and on a national holiday, no less. We really appreciate that. And we hope we can have a nice and engaging conversation, an open discussion, in fact, among peers, rather than it being sort of unidirectional. And it will be participatory in some capacity. So my name is Dimitri Katsiras. I'll be chairing this meeting, and I'm the Research and Programs Manager at GISF. For those of you who don't know us, the Global Interagency Security Forum is a membership-led network of about 137 international organizations in the humanitarian development and peace space that we focus on security risk management and the safety of aid workers. And to my left, I have our two guest speakers, Anaïd Nahikian and Emmanuel Chong. Anaïd is a senior researcher who's affiliated with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. She has over 15 years experience in this space and humanitarianism and development, has done a series of roles in the World Bank, the Norwegian Refugee Council, Save the Children, and others. Researcher by trade, at least she's proud of that. And her research has focused in three different areas. First, in resilience in fragile and conflict-affected countries and regions, in humanitarian negotiation, and in localization, which is timely for the topic of today. And then beside her, there's Emmanuel Chong, who's also a senior researcher affiliated with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. He has over 30 years, or nearly 30 years experience, apologies, in the humanitarian space. He's a veteran, basically. And yeah, he's been the head of missions for Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, in numerous places. Has led some key projects like in humanitarian access and negotiation with Conflict Dynamics International. Is that correct? Yeah. And most recently has been the senior humanitarian advisor for an executive negotiation project at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And he also is most recently also head of outreach and engagement at the H2H network, which has hosted a number of sessions in this conference and have a stand in the corner of the hall. So we do recommend that you pass by if you get a chance, if you haven't done so already. Great. All right. It is a bit of a hybrid session, so I do apologize for the few guests that are online. If you have any issues hearing or anything like that, please feel free to just send us a message. We have support staff behind me that help with any technical issues you may have. So the topic we're discussing today is looking at the intersection of neutrality, access, and localization. Now, those are three pretty major topics that can be talked about ad nauseum on their own, but we're trying to look at the interplay very specifically. And we're looking at how the conceptions and realities of our understanding of neutrality as a principle, which is increasingly becoming contested, how those are being informed or are informing the shift towards localization, and how those shifts are impacting access, security, aid security, and the selection and management of partnerships when it comes to security between international and local actors. So that is where we're really going to focus our conversation. Both Anaïd and Emmanuel will be discussing a report that GISF has commissioned, and they're the co-authors of, that is in progress and that we are hoping to publish in the coming months, looking at this interplay and trying to unpack really how localization could potentially be a vector to weed away a bit or unpeel rather, the complex onion that is the concept of neutrality in operations and then access and acceptance. And so this conversation serves as a way to essentially potentially validate some of the initial findings that have come out of their research, and also get additional insights from all these practitioners and experts who are in this room with us today. So I'll pass it on to, I believe, Emmanuel will begin, right? So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. And, thank you all to be here today for this conversation. I don't know exactly what attracted you to come to this session today, if it's the term neutrality or access and localization, but I think when in my field humanitarian experience, when we want to discuss neutrality, it should imply our capacity to engage in controversies, because it's probably the humanitarian principle that brings major debates, interpretation, and misunderstandings among humanitarian stakeholders, but as well with regards to any actor on the ground. And I do not know any national authority, for example, any minister or even any non-state armed groups that really understand the term neutrality as we try to put in place as humanitarians. First of all, in the civil domain, when you say you do not take sides, it means you are impartial. The judge does not take sides. He's impartial. He's not neutral, of course. It's never used. And when you engage with a stakeholder on the ground, and particularly local actors, there is always this dimension in the reflection and the discussion around, do you really understand our sufferings? Do you understand what's going on today in our context environment? And if so, how far you are ready to go to carry this reality by action and by raising awareness about the particular situation. And that's where the controversy starts, because first of all, humanitarian action implies to exclude, to make choices. We're going to exclude programs, realities, people. All of these people that are excluded on a daily basis, and they are numerous. Probably the majority of the people we pass through around in our humanitarian programs, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Sahel region, etc. All of these people, they hear us stating our humanitarian principles, talking about neutrality, talking about how this neutrality is going to offer some access opportunities, but you can imagine how they can be not only frustrated, but dubitative about what does it mean. And even if we look at the programs we dedicate, and we are in the room, fellow colleagues from UNHCR, on refugees and IDPs, one of the first reflection by local communities, what is it? When you set up a camp in Degale, what is it, the first reflection? Okay, you support these people, you do not support us, but we deserve attention as well, we deserve support. And all of this brings some reflection about not only the compromise, but the kind of practical arrangements humanitarian actors take on a daily basis, and particularly with regards to this neutrality dimension. Because in the sense, these arrangements means that we're going to also decide the visibility of the activity that we carry on. And I just would like to take a couple of examples that I have in my experience with MSF. And it's true at MSF, there is always a tension between acting and denunciating, because at the end of the day, it's a question of how far we want to go to denunciate. The absence of access, the incapacity to implement principles, because we have to compromise so heavily with the stakeholders on the ground that it's really difficult to engage. But this visibility of choices, I think informally or formally in terms of engagement, it has major consequences. And probably that's why this research is interesting at this period of time. And I believe there are many actors in the room I know that have very long-standing humanitarian experiences at the field since the 90s in particular. There is probably a trend with regards to our capacity to make visible our own decisions, limitations, and meaning to show our capacity to be neutral in an environment where we are part of political controversies. And this, for me, there is a shift since Syria tragedy 2012, where in particular, and we have seen that as well in the discussions we had with the practitioner from this research, there was a kind of clear cut between our capacity to act and present our activities while engaging in this field of respecting humanitarian principle, or to trying to understand the importance of humanitarian principles. So it's great we can have this conversation today, and it's going to bring many reflection on the local actors as well, because we are trying to reflect on local actors now, I would say emergence and a reality on the ground, which has been for years underestimated. But I would like to give you a couple of findings from the conversations we had with key stakeholders on this neutrality in conflicts. First of all, it's clear that neutrality, if you start the idea of a strict adherence on neutrality, it's gonna cut some opportunities for engaging with actors. That sounds an important element, and particularly it's gonna underline some political issues that are at the core, and we are not talking about at the mouth of humanitarians, but at the core of the heart of the people today, because the people today on the ground, what we call very badly beneficiaries, for example, or affected people, they are more interested by what we can say about their conditions, about more than what we're going to provide in terms of basic assistance, because we provide basic assistance, by the way, mainly. And this strict adherence is something that should be critically discussed. There is probably a reality of pragmatism when we are talking about neutrality. This morning, I heard in another session a representative of Sphere Standard and was saying that there is a scale of importance in terms of humanitarian principles. And I believe you all know what is the humanitarian principle that is the most important according to Sphere Standards. Anyone? What is, according to humanity? Say humanity first. Do you think they put neutrality on second? Do you think? No. Impartiality came on second. After neutrality on third, and independence. I was surprised in the sense we put ourselves, try to convince, we need to put some scale a bit at a different level in terms of humanitarian principles. But for me, it reflects this difficulty between dogmatic approach. We want to be on this strict adherence because the humanitarian system is pushed at its corner by the donors, by the key stakeholders to be very, I would say, impactful and coherent and comprehensive, etc. But we know that pragmatic use of principles, that's the only way. That's the only way. And I remember when I started with MSF, we had some reflection because at the time we decided to publish the dictionary for practical use of international humanitarian law. The first institution that criticized us to do that, and I don't know if there's anyone in the room, but very deeply and very strongly was the ICRC. It was not the Russia Federation or the others, United States, it was ICRC. It's MSF. How can you do that? How can you manipulate the principles like this way to make it something, a vehicle for engaging? I don't want to criticize the ICRC per se, but it was just a reflection. The second element I would like to mention is the fact that we know that humanitarian actors have three ways to engage in this neutrality concept, definition. Or the first, it's a strategic operational poster. For strategic reason, on time to time, we need to promote this. Definitely, if you try to engage with the Chinese authorities, I think they will probably ask you, what do you think about supporting Uyghur community or not, etc. When we think about having programs in Tibetan part, etc. That's the first way, I think. It's the most common one, I think, where humanitarians are, and which is easy to manage with. But easy, not very easy, but at least practical. It's a practical. The second one is the political stance. We are not so many. I think there are not so many actors that are keen to engage on the political stance. What we cannot accept from Damascus authorities, what will be the real red lines? You know, we are very good to say we have red lines. Right? And the third is the moral one. It's true, neutrality probably vehiculate lots of moral aspects, moral dimension. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind, particularly when we engage with conflicting parties. The third thing I would like to mention is that what we have seen on the ground more and more is the fact that the more you're going to engage on this principle approach, and particularly on the neutrality dimension, probably the less you're going to have the capacity to look at or respond to the priorities of affected communities, even with good intentions. I can take just the example of Obazonia in Cameroon. I remember a couple of years ago when there was the eruption of this crisis and the tension by this Anglophone community with regards to Yaoundé authorities, and the challenge for humanitarians to really be able to engage in this environment and really negotiate on a neutrality base. You know, it has been nearly impossible, and it was more at the time. The American ambassador and the Swiss ambassador, Pietro Lazzeri, that was there, but have been in capacity to discuss humanitarian access and neutrality. And Swiss was really carrying this dossier with neutrality more than humanitarian actors, and particularly the humanitarian coordinator. Unfortunately, Allegra was put persona non grata by the authorities because she tried to. So just to say, I think it's an important thing, how this neutrality dimension brings us some opportunities to look at the priorities of affected communities. The last 2 points I would like to mention is that, because it's important to link it with the security dimension, and the questions you have is that it raises a lot of ethical questions. I think the concessions we're going to make in terms of access and security when thinking about neutrality, cross-border activities, for example, deciding to have an army escort, you know, on the ground, or to really try to support a particular environment and group, because in terms of access, the other sides can accept it. I remember in the 90s, for example, the first period of time of the Taliban regime, they were really laughing when we were going to the Badr Sham to support the North Alliance. They were saying, oh, bring your team to them. You know, they were not really taking care of it. Probably it's going to be different today. On the other hand, other actors, Prime Minister in Ethiopia, Meles, he was really taking care a lot about the things you're going to do in areas he considers could be his enemy, Ogaden, other areas, etc., etc. So all of this point in terms of security of the concession. And the last thing is perhaps to say that it's important when we think about neutrality, how, practically speaking, it will provide a positive effect of our operations, or really reduce the effectiveness of our operations. And where are our responsibilities as humanitarian actors, particularly today? And I would say it's mainly the international humanitarian actors that engage in this field of neutrality. And we will give you examples on how local actors are far more pragmatic, and I would say they have no alternative than to be engaged in, politically speaking, or to be seen as a part, you know, because it's so easy as MSF to do conferences in Paris, more than to do it as a humanitarian local actors on the ground today in a particular place. So I'm going to stop here, but I wanted to give you a bit this global reflections from the report and our experience. And I give the floor to Anaïd to jump in the national actors localization programming and the link with neutrality and access. Thank you.
I'll start by just mentioning a word about research. The findings that we have that have come out of this work is mainly linked to literature review, but also a series of in-depth interviews with practitioners and with, in particular, practitioners who are national staff of international organizations or national staff of national NGOs. And we wanted to, as well as experts who are dealing with issues around localization and neutrality, people who are perhaps now stepped outside of their operational capacities in the sector and are reflecting now on some of these sort of age-old issues, because of course the humanitarian principles are an enduring issue and dilemma in the sector. But at least from my perspective and what I'd like to share today is not my operational experience. As Dimitri mentioned, I'm a researcher, I'm a sociologist by training, but it's much more to try to bring to the fore some of what these local practitioners have shared in terms of their own experience as working with INGOs and working particularly in and on hard to reach areas. And what does the concept of neutrality really mean to them? And I think some of the insights are very interesting. I found them interesting, and I hope you will too. But we'll keep it simple. I'd like to stick to really 3 or 4 main points. The first one that I'd like to raise is this issue. And again, I'll just preface this by saying all of these come from the interviews, but at the same time, I don't think we can generalize based on the number of interviews that we've done. But I think that's still an interesting insight. The question of whether it even is essential for a humanitarian actor to be neutral. And I'll frame some of these questions because I hope they'll trigger some conversation later on for all of us. How important is it? How essential is it? And can one be humanitarian? Can one engage in the humanitarian gesture, so to speak, without being neutral? And how can one even conceive of being neutral in an environment that is so politically charged, where your family is affected and so forth? That was one of the main areas that was discussed through all of the interviews. And I would venture to say, and I put this in quotes, one practitioner who said neutrality is meaningless. And I think that's really interesting to hear. Why? Because for her, what she was saying is that, and I quote, the neutrality is in the mouth, it's not in the heart. And I think Emmanuel alluded to this, but the idea is that as a local NGO, as a local practitioner, they are required to speak about neutrality, present their operations and their work as neutral, but at the heart of it, in their own way. Are they really neutral, or is this a communication? Is this a visibility issue? And I don't think we need to put it in tension with, does that mean they're really humanitarian? I don't think that binary exists. I think it's something that needs to be spoken more in a nuanced way. The second thing I wanted to raise is this issue about taking sides. And one practitioner mentioned not the importance of, are you on one side or on the other, but rather this concept of equidistance from both sides. And I think that's the operational space where we may want to think about how to engage in these operations, but also how, as international NGOs, we could or should expect our local partners to engage, is with this equidistance wherever possible to the warring parties. In terms of neutrality, there's one concept I wanted to raise here, and all of these issues are interlinked, of course, but it's the relationship between international organizations, their donors, and the responsibilities and pressures that donors put and the states put on donors, and the donors put on INGOs, and the INGOs put on NGOs as implementing partners to demonstrate neutrality. There are even some organizations, as I'm sure you know, who hire people who are charged in their terms of reference, in their scope of work, to track and ensure compliance with neutrality. And I say compliance because that's what came out in the conversation. Neutrality, in the perspective of some of these people we interviewed, is not an issue of professional standards. It's not an issue of a moral position. It's not an issue of how do we operate strategically. It's really about compliance. Am I too visible? Am I putting this flag up in my office? Am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do that? And there have been circumstances where organizations have even had to engage in punitive consequences for staff members who don't appear to be neutral to demonstrate to their donors that they are indeed enforcing this notion of neutrality. So I think some of these dynamics are quite interesting and actually lead me to my final point. Sometimes in the literature and in some of the interviews, there's been this notion that, well, the humanitarian principles and neutrality is a Western posture. Maybe, and we can get into that discussion. But I think when you take it from the perspective of a local actor, it's not about a Western posture. It's when you consider all of these cascading effects of compliance, of trying to put local humanitarian actors in hard to reach areas where INGOs don't have access, bringing the burden of risk to a higher level to these agencies. All of these cascading effects are what create resistance within the local actors vis-a-vis compliance. It's not necessarily, well, this is a Western posture. It's that we have been constrained. We don't have the autonomy to work as we'd like to. Again, I quote, we're being instrumentalized, we're, quote, cheap labor. There are a lot of these notions that have nothing to do with being Western and non-Western, although we can also get into the history of some of these colonial notions. But practically speaking, there are a lot of other things that influence the degree to which there might be resistance to embracing and ultimately operating in a way that INGOs would deem neutral enough or principled enough. So these are some of the four kind of maybe newer ideas, I guess, that came out of the research that I wanted to share. And again, this is a really discussion opportunity. I really want to hear, we want to hear what you think on these issues.
All right, well, thank you both for providing a nice start framing of the concept of neutrality as some of the dilemmas, both ethically and operationally, that you've demonstrated, Emmanuel, and also for bringing in perspectives from the various participants who took part in our study and some of the bold statements that have been made. A lot of food for thought, a lot of elements to kind of unpack a little further. And this is where we were hoping to have a very open, frank, honest discussion. Not your sort of typical Q&A, but we can begin with some questions. We do have some prompting questions in any case. But yeah, just first to gather your thoughts and gather from your perspectives, what do you think needs to happen when it comes to neutrality? Do we approach it in the very rigid way that we have been approaching it? Do we need to think about it differently, especially as we're shifting towards localization? I'd open the floor to anybody who might be interested in intervening here. Please go ahead.
Neil Elliott from Oxfam. Now, we're a humanitarian actor, but we're also an advocacy in campaigns. Therefore, when we go into a lot of countries, let's take Ukraine and Gaza, we haven't taken a neutral stand. We've been very anti one side or another. Or, we closed operations down in Russia so we could operate in Ukraine. We made that stance, and it was quite public stance. Gaza, we actually have gone out and used the genocide word from almost day one. And we've been quite, and we look at our campaigning and our advocacy, how it affects our humanitarian sides. We had to balance that, as well as being a massive push for localization, either from making Oxfam local or working through local partners, and understanding those local partners, again, what their stance on neutrality and even impartiality comes into question. And the other bit we haven't talked about is are we really independent? And if you're donor heavily reliant on donors, can you have that stance of independence and the likes? Because donors, as you said, their compliance requirements are huge. Things like counter-terrorist legislation really, really causes a lot of problems on how we operate in any given area and who we act with and have access to. So all those areas we look at, and I've come into, from many years working just purely humanitarian, come into this dual mandated organization that actually every time we go in for a major humanitarian operation in almost every country, how does our campaigning advocacy affect that that our humanitarian operation. Yeah, for me, I've thrown the neutrality flag away a decade or even further. And even sometimes you question the impartiality because who do you give aid to? We quite often step over certain groups of people, especially local communities, to get to displaced communities. And actually, when you do your needs assessment, that local community is worse off than your displaced community or refugee community even. I've come across that in places like Chad. So some people have been asked that question more and more. So it'd be very interesting to see what your papers are going to research is going to come out. How much of that will actually focus our minds on and questioning our own operating models or the way we think of ourselves. I don't know if that was a question or a statement. I'm not sure.
No, that's a point. It's you made a frank assessment of how you've ditched some of the principles in your work, but also the importance of taking a stand. So I welcome any other thoughts. Yeah, of course.
Was there someone first? No. Okay. Just a quick reflection. I mean, echoing what the two great panelists mentioned before. I mean, I find neutrality is quite interpreted in very different ways across organizations. More often than not, it's used in a very restrictive way, right? And we think, well, we are neutral because we have forbidden the staff to hang that flag in the office or dress that way, or in Myanmar, go to the protest, not go to the protest. But, I always think it doesn't matter what we think. It's the perceived neutrality, what the interlocutor, the other side, that can impede access or restrict us, what they think. So what are some good practices you have seen when it comes to trying to measure the perception of neutrality? Because then again, we may think and define ourselves as neutral, but the way we're looked at by those who we want to be perceived as neutral from, it can be different.
Appreciate that. Did you have as well? You can jump in.
Yeah, maybe to kind of build on that as well. Sorry, I'm David. I'm a student, aspiring humanitarian. Maybe kind of building on that. I think as humanitarians, there's often kind of the idea that humanitarian aid is apolitical, or it wants to be apolitical, but it really isn't, because it operates in a very political environment. And so kind of building on that, even though I think humanitarians often like to think of themselves as neutral, but even kind of taking that neutral stance is a political action.
Yeah.
A lot of the times.
Thank you for flagging that. It's very important. I think for a moment, because there was a question being posed, might be good to go back in terms of potential good practices on how to basically evaluate how perceptions can affect neutrality. And yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on.
No, and before that, I have an anecdote with Oxfam, so I don't know if you.
Everyone does.
No, but I remember once, as you know, as well, MSF, we are extremely engaged, and it's an organization extremely engaged in advocacy campaigning. And once we had a conversation with an authority, it was with the Ethiopian authorities, I can say, about the Ogaden crisis, and they were asking us, do you plan to do an Oxfam campaign approach, or do you plan to do a real MSF campaign approach? So they were making a kind of difference, because it's true. The way we have seen Oxfam and MSF, we use Oxfam on many aspects, because you are carrying a very global perspective about sufferings of people in all dimensions, which I think many organizations, as you said, each organization is different, but I think it's true. We have to acknowledge the fact that today, as a local organizations, to envisage to run an advocacy campaign is to prepare your death, prepare to kill your organization.
Yeah.
Let's be blunt and clear. In any circumstances today, even in Turkey, even in Syria, even in North Korea, you can imagine going just envisaging this, just to think about it. So it's very difficult, and it's true. In the reflections we have with our local NGO counterparts conversation, and that does not mean they really only believe that it should go through international campaigning. an advocacy campaign, they would really be keen to do something. And I remember as well the difficulties we have to. We always say, we should say always as an NGO, we are not the voice of the people. We are not the voice of people about our sufferings, but we try to reflect a bit some realities. But yesterday we had a session on local media in Sudan, and it's incredible how this current tragedy, this ongoing tragedy, is in all the news, but not really addressed, by the humanitarian system. So just to say this, it's a reflection about the campaigning, the challenge to campaign. In terms of good practices to measure this neutrality, I would say the easiest one that we have seen, in the past decades of humanitarian intervention is to balance your geographical footprint. It's something that can be appreciated by the authorities, or by apart the fact that if they consider these geographical areas, and just I had the opportunity to do a research with HHI in Ukraine in the confidence zone in 2019. So it's first part of the war at the time, but I was amazed how the humanitarian organization based in Kiev, Kramatorsk, Dnipro, bluntly, we're trying a lot more to engage with the Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast, because they were seeing how we are so unbalanced in terms of activities, that how can we discuss with the Russian, how can we discuss with the separatists, and to say we are neutral. They were trying and passing through this humanitarian committee based in Donetsk that were really restricting the access apart from the ICRC, UNICEF, and very few on very constricting. So there is this geographical stuff, which can make sense, I think, and should be seen as a good practice. There is also the thematic, because thematic can break as well some distance and show your neutrality. And I think it's true. You have some humanitarian programmings that can be seen easily as universal health activities, etc., while others are more challenging to demonstrate as neutral. Dropping assistance today in the Gaza Strip, is it really something first humanitarian, or is it something very neutral? Honestly, it's difficult to demonstrate. You see, even for the people that receive this dropping. So, but the good practices for me is to be sure we try to engage on a very, as said, Anaïd, on a very trust manner with our local partners. Because what is really striking me in this period of time is the fact that in this emergence of local actors, leadership and co-leading, or at least engaging directly on programs, which is great, is the fact that they are very afraid to engage on the controversial and security and principles issues. They don't want to do it because they are so afraid to lose their fundings. So now they're going to prefer hide the compromise of the things they're going to do for affected communities or armed groups on the ground in the forest, where they're going to give a car, they're going to give food, they're going to give assets, they're going to pay the mayor in a place, but they will never say to UNICEF, to UNHCR, NRC, DRC, etc., because they are so afraid of the consequences. So I think we cannot talk about good practices if we are not able to reflect on the fact the practices we want to obtain, because we all talk about quality standard. If it's not potentially something feasible on the ground, we put them in trouble and we cannot say it's good practice. I would say this first reflection.
I welcome any additional reflections from you.
No, just to echo, at least from the research, I think there was definitely this sense that geographic distribution is important. However, to note, as I'm sure you all know, that there are concessions made at the operational level, especially in hard to reach areas, to say, on the one hand, are we going to risk insecurity, of course, but risk, if we think about risk in a larger sense than insecurity, we have reputational risk, political risk, fiduciary. There are a number of risks that go into the calculation for access. What does this mean? Are we playing it safe? And there are some interviewees who said, when you really zoom out, the scope of coverage of INGOs in a lot of these contexts is actually quite low. And they're counting numbers, perhaps generously in terms of maybe because they have implementing partners. But the actual coverage is actually quite low because there's a concession there made to say, okay, we want to make sure that we are able to deliver in these areas, even though they might not be the most needed areas, just so that we can continue to operate. But we're not willing to have those tough conversations and really gain access in some of these other pockets of areas that may be more inaccessible. Yeah, I'll stop there.
See a lot of hands up. All right, well, we can start in the front and then move way back.
Okay, I'll abuse my power because I work for GSF, though I wasn't part of the research. Just a couple of points, just to begin with. My initial reflection is, regardless of your operational experience, that can be 20, 30 years, it's such a mind-boggling issue. And it's really hard to get your head around the humanitarian principles. So there are times that you question yourself, and you can't really help that. What helps, in my opinion, and I might contradict myself later on because it's not easy to articulate these things, is to question ourselves if neutrality really matters the same in every context. Is codification of armed conflicts, does codification of the armed conflicts matter? And I'll be some more practical so you can understand my my pathway of thinking. Let's take the example of international conflict where the impact on civilians is one-sided. Does it really matter? Let's make it more practical. Something about Ukraine, Russia, something about Israel, Palestine, international conflict, one-sided impact. So from an operational perspective, I'm not going to talk about ethical, principled approach. I'll leave it on the side because you can talk about it for hours and you won't really reach conclusion. Does it really make a big difference operationally? In my opinion, not really. Doesn't really make a huge change. So when does it really, really, really matter? Again, and that's when you start like getting into the weeds of it. Oh, well, it does matter. And I'm going to consult my notes because I'm going to lose my train of thought. Well, yes, it does matter when you have a severe impact on both sides of the conflict, and I'm talking about civilians. So in that case, operationally, it does really matter because 1 month, what we find in the field is that those conflicts are unpredictable. 1 month, one side tends to prevail. Next month, the balance is shifting on the other side. So you need to, very early in the conflict, you can't really predict how the conflict is going to play out because it's not an international conflict with a predominant player. So from the beginning, you need to be neutral. Otherwise, you're going to lose the game. So if you try to be neutral like a few months into the conflict, forget about it. You've lost already your credibility. When it becomes even more difficult is not inter-community conflict, intra-tribal conflict, for example, but in civil war situations. That's when it becomes very, very murky, especially when government is involved and when government has overpowering capacity over the other side. Point in case, for example, Syria or Ethiopia. So in those cases, again, operationally does matter because if you're not neutral, then you risk like losing access. So we start linking with access, with acceptance, with SRM. So I'll stop here. I just put for everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Panos. Long intervention, but still a good one. I see that there was still a lot of hands up, but I do want to not ignore. I think there was a question in the chat for one person to raise their hand. I was pointing out in the corner. Oh, pointing in the corner. Apologies for that. Okay, I might have missed it then, I guess. All right, well, we can continue though there, and then we'll shift to the right if that's all right. Who had their hand up? We'll get the gentleman in the back first. Yeah, right there.
I'm actually going to have to leave.
That's fine.
Yeah,
No
I
worries.
bet you had a question.
It was more reflection.
Yeah,
So it doesn't
yeah,
matter.
please.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go.
No, I was just going to say, as ex-head of humanitarian campaigns for Oxfam,
Ah.
in the sort of MSF Oxfam argument, I think whenever I joined Oxfam was in 2009, and it felt very humanitarian, and it was very much based around humanitarian principles. In the last 15 years, I think what's changed is the world has changed. And people, the Arab Spring happened, and people want to use more active citizenship. So if you're a local actor on the ground, I think it's felt to be quite patronizing because you felt like you're only dealing with the consequences of the conflict or whatever crisis it is and not the causes. So I think it's just, that's what's happened in that sort of passage of time. And of course, Hugo Slim's been writing a lot about humanitarian resistance recently, hasn't he, as well? And I think that, I don't always agree with them, but I think that's definitely sort of
After an ICSC long period of work.
yeah, no, well, we don't need to get into that. So just think it's I think it's the passing of time, really.
Thank you for offering that reflection before you had to head off. Appreciate that. I'll go back to John there.
Hello, I'm Pavel from Save the Children.
If you can speak up, it'd be great.
Sorry, Pavel from Romania from Save the Children UK. I think it was important point on perception as well. And I think and the question is how much control we have of the narrative of our own organizations especially with social media. And I'll give you an example where Save the Children, obviously adhering to the principles that in the beginning of the Israel-Gaza conflict, we had colleagues in the Middle East leaving because it's international organizations, right? As Save the Children. So we talk about localization, but it's also our organizations are very diverse, are global, some of them with colleagues across the globe. And what we sort of, instead of like what we try to control some of the narrative with social media that's coming out and speaking to colleagues, especially younger colleagues, new to the sectors with like a lot of activism being seen on social media and trying to sort of see what's possible, what's coming out. And then that's why the question of perception is very important as well. Because of course, as an organization, we can put up a statement or this, we are neutral, we're doing that, but how we can control, as you say, what's in the, it's not what the mouth is, what's in the hearts as well. Control our own colleagues who have things to say, they're very vocal about how they feel about conflict, about certain issues. And I think that's another complexity that in terms of like the narrative and what we put out instead of us needing to rethink of how we engage our own colleagues and teams.
Absolutely.
Into building that narrative.
Thank you. It is true. Organizations are not monolithic. There's all kinds of voices, and how to manage that as well is important. I'll first go here and then there. That's right.
To pick up on the topic there about civil wars, so I'm a consultant. I did a bunch of work last year looking at civil wars where states blockade, and obviously got into the neutrality question and the function of that. And when you look at the way that the aid system, right, sits in the cities, it operates on position of government, then there's HR classes and all of that is based around that just bureaucratic and operational reality, right? So the minute that you have a state who is party to the conflict of a civil war and is choosing not to allow aid, the whole thing becomes very unneutral almost from day dot. And I think I've talked about that. We're in a different world now. We're not in the 90s, sort of waving a white flag and driving across front lines isn't the reality in many of those kinds of conflicts anymore. And so I've debated, and as part of that research, probably with some of the people that you've talked to as well, about how do we look at neutrality. I think the resistance neutrality binary is unhelpful because it kind of entrenches us further into a like either we're ripping flags off walls and not going to protests, or we are part of the fight. But actually was looking at, is there a way to look at the neutrality of the response as a whole in those types of settings? Is the response as a whole in sort of that ecosystem looking at how do we reach all of the people based on need equally, not necessarily from the capital city, and what are the modalities that would be required to do that? Does everybody have to all be doing exactly the same thing? Do we have to be focusing on every organization being able to operate geographically in both areas, or as long as the response in totality is operating in all of those areas and is therefore sort of a neutral response and the sector is operating neutrally in that environment? Is that somehow an acceptable countermeasure when the circumstances are imperfect? You know, because otherwise you have a whole lot of people taking down flags off the walls and gone, and not going through a protest, and a whole bunch of starving people that no one is getting to because, and that doesn't seem neutral either. So trying to unpack how do you logistically separate neutrality from it?
Appreciate that. Thank you. We'll just take one more before we can go back to there, and then we'll make a bit of a shift. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Dimitri. I find fascinating this conversation about neutrality and localization. From a personal perspective, I'm going to be like very frank, do like kind of a catharsis here, because I feel that the neutrality discussion has been very, very centered in the international arena, and what Anna said about neutrality being in the mouth and not in the heart is like really, I think, when you are like part of a conflict zone. So I'm Colombian. I'm a very lucky Colombian because I had the chance to study the humanitarian sector, to be involved in other kind of activities related to the humanitarian sector. And when I went back to Colombia and tried to work as a national, it was completely like I don't know, like impossible, because all this thing about neutrality makes you always like show or yeah, it makes you like less capable of being neutral, right? And I would say that the neutrality discussion comes more in it should be more in an individual and person-centered approach rather than really like if it's local or not. Because in the end, being able to behave as a neutral actor in these kind of situations come more from professionalism and understanding what it means in terms of access, in terms of security, rather than if you are part of a X or Y organization or if you are national or international. So if we want to like do this, I don't know, like try to understand localization and neutrality, I would say the discussions really need to go about what are the capacities of the people that are working there and how professional are they in order to be neutral, or not be, but at least behave neutral in the context, rather than just saying if someone is like, if not someone, but the organizations are like doing advocacy or taking part in the conflicts or these kind of things, because otherwise the barrier is going to be there always. And the discussion in the end is not about neutrality per se, but about professionalism of the humanitarian sector.
Thank you very much for that and for tying it back to the localization lens and the question that we have about whether local actors can truly maintain neutrality when it comes to responding to local community needs. I'll take a moment to ask the speakers if, with all the different interactions we've had here, what immediate reflections come to mind, some key points you want to respond to, or some questions specifically that have been posed.
Thank you, Mariana. I'd like to pick up on this last point, which is a critical point. And I think, of course, being self-conscious in doing the research, these are questions that are really important. And you're raising a topic that I did want to ask of the group here, is to say, when we talk about neutrality, when we talk about compliance and neutrality, what's really behind it? And sometimes I wonder, and again, this is, well, more or less closed space, but I want to start asking these questions to say, to what extent are these measures and these impositions of compliance aiming, even somehow structurally, to undermine the credibility of the people and to make them to put them in a situation where they cannot actually emerge as autonomous organizations, autonomous humanitarians that are not under the control of all of these standards and structures that are imposed. That goes with neutrality, it goes with other things as well. And sometimes I wonder, are some of these issues that we talk about in localization, in quotes, around financing, around capacity building, around coordination, around all of these things, is this a euphemism for other things? What are we really talking about? Is capacity building, what does it mean? Where's the trust in that? What is saying we need to build capacity of local actors? What does that actually mean about the ways in which local actors are trusted and entrusted to do the work that they should be doing and that they're perfectly capable of doing on the ground? Likewise, for issues around principled humanitarian approaches, just like neutrality and principles are reinterpreted based on the mandate and the organization, it's interpreted based on not only the individual operating, but also the organization and the context in which it's being implemented. So things around, capacity building financing, I would be keen to get away from these sort of standard pillars of the challenges of localization and really talk about what do these hindrances and obstacles, what's behind them? What is dragging the possibility of a more localized approach? What goes, this very minor, minimal percentage of aid of donorship that is going to local organizations directly. Why is this still the case? Where are the conversations that we can have that are really challenging the system? These are some of the questions that I'd like to ask of you, and thank you, Mariana, for raising some of those points as well.
Thank you, Annette. Emmanuel, please go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, I think we should not underestimate the national authorities' pressure to limit NGOs, local NGOs' existence and independence. And from independence, you can talk about impartiality and neutrality, but without this, it's difficult, and it's true. Main local NGOs that exist in the sector were before development organization or human rights one, and it's difficult to continue on human rights, so they are jumping with humanitarian crisis, and they are engaging in this pathway, but they are struggling. They're already struggling a lot to comply to all our standards and processes we put in place as an international umbrella and enterprise, but as well. It's extremely challenging on the ground to operate as a non-governmental organization, and I think there's lots of challenges around this. The second thing is when you were mentioning Panos, the scale of conflicts where neutrality is perhaps could be matters different. I understand, and I would agree as it was perhaps in the 90s before, but today when you discuss with the Taliban authorities, the difference you see even 25 years before is that the fact they are highly connected to what we do, who we are. And they can really, in 2 minutes, explain us our incoherence, our lack of neutrality, etc., and what do they see as important. But each groups now, the UVs, the others, they have webmasters, they have guys that are following humanitarian enterprise very deeply, and I know Ashley Jackson has worked a bit about this on the Taliban, but they're still under analysis about how good they are to follow what we are doing, as doing, Turkish authorities, Syrian authorities, every time, etc. And I remember, for example, with authorities, their incapacity to take out, dossiers from organizations that are 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and they come back to it. The Syrians, they have been very good on this, past years. So I think this reality of now everything is tracked, everything is visible. I think it's difficult to announce this on this neutrality. On the perception, what I would like to say is that I think it's not a problem to accept the fact that perceptions gonna exist. And as said, Anaid, and as you all said, we have individual perceptions and there are perceptions as an organization. But it's true what is important, and it's perhaps with my old-fashioned approach, but when you work with an organization and you have to accept the fact that more than your thoughts and views, it's important the organization. And I think it's important to continue to vehiculate, within the staff, local or international, this necessity to think about your organization, mandate, not mandated, not mandated, but that is very important. And we have seen that with UNRWA staff, whether they have been criticized to be neutral, the vast majority of UNRWA staff want to care about UNRWA first and not about, this war. So I think it's important to promote this notion of organizations. And the last thing on the donors, what you refer, and the red flags on neutrality, I think one of the concerns we can have, because the vast majority of humanitarian organizations are falling in the hands of donors today, fortunately and unfortunately. But what is clear is that donors fulfill very different agendas, for the vast majority hidden, and that they will never engage on a transparent manner with the humanitarian organizations. And the consequences are there, because I don't want to name any authorities here or any donors, but when a state authority is engaged to support a kind of military apparatus in a country, and we have many donors that are very generous with humanitarian sector that do that. Do you really believe that they're gonna support local NGOs in this environment where they have trained military apparatus and urban brigade to really promote local NGOs empowerment? Let's be clear, it's not gonna happen. So I think I don't see very courageous statement from international organization to not criticize, but put a bit more pressure about the donors in coherence and really how they are fueling, at the end of the day, some conflicts, autocratic regime support, on yearly basis. And France is a specialist for that, I think even Emmanuel Macron, who said he will not do it, specialist for that. So I think it's important to look at it with a critical reflection.
Thank you for that as well. I just wanted to also point out a comment in the chat from Maureen Maggie. Sorry if I'm spelling or mispronouncing rather. Many security risk management policies state that employees need to be impartial and neutral in substance and appearance. This can be seen in tension with freedom of speech, expression, etc. Yet in certain conflict settings, it is key for security individuals and operations. So are there any practical solutions to this dilemma? It's a question being posed by one of our guests online. Are there any other questions that, or statements rather, that anybody has regarding several of the topics that we talked about today, whether we want to just look at neutrality as a principle, a localization angle, or also looking at security neutrality and acceptance-based strategies? Are they a practical solution for security risks in conflict zones, for instance? These kind of elements I want to bring up back, or actually Anaid actually mentioned a number of questions as well and posed those. So we'll first go to him and then, yeah, sorry.
Hi, I'm Basil. I work for GSERF, Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund. So we're working in prevention of violent extremism. So our sole purpose is to fund civil society organizations in communities that are impacted by violent extremism. Like around 70% of our funding goes directly to the civil society organizations. So to answer your question, what are the hindrances? I think there's at least two that I can mention. The first one is that we need to give up power. Western organizations, to be clear, need to give up power and accept that most of the implementation will go to the local actor. And that is difficult. And sometimes it's difficult from our own staff. I worked for 20 years in humanitarian action. And sometimes the most resistant to collaboration with local civil society organizations were our own staff, our own local staff, because we're giving an expertise to people and they feel that they have something that is special. And if you try to transfer this power to other local actors, they may find it a problem. So it's also difficult because of our own culture, whether we're Westerners or local staff. We have a professional culture as well. You're making people think that they're special with their expertise, and then it's difficult for them to relinquish that power. The second thing that I can mention is also around the fact that our colleagues are very often collaborating or working with both sides of the conflict. With GSERF, we're working with organizations that are working in prevention of violent extremism. Sometimes they work with repentees from violent extremist organizations, and they're working with the communities that were impacted. So they are actually at this junction between the two opposite sides. And like Maureen is saying, your staff need to be neutral. In that case, you need to accept that you need to be at maybe not equidistance, but you need to be in the middle in order to be able to work with both parties, even if personally you may have some sympathies for one side or the other.
Thank you for that interesting bit about gatekeepers sometimes preventing real localization from taking effect, and some of that's the challenges tied to professionalism, and it's also the equidistance bit is very interesting as well. Yeah, I see there's something. But actually, sorry, apologies, I missed Heather. If that's okay, you can jump in.
If there are other people. Okay,
Yeah, go ahead.
I
Sorry.
was interested in this this thing that you were discussing right at the beginning about I think it was Sphere you said, who'd said that there was a scale of humanitarian principles.
Sphere standard.
Sphere standard, yeah, versus the sort of, let's say, traditional kind of all the principles equal. And then you were mentioning, because you were both very neutral on that, you didn't say which was your, which you were sort of presenting it as a, opinion. But then you were talking also about, and he was talking about sort of one of the ways of being perceived as neutral is sort of making sure that you're working across sort of geographical locations. But then that might in itself be, that might not be impartial. Because actually there might not be the need across, you might be working in, I think you mentioned that, you might be working in geographical areas to sort of fulfill that sort of neutral thing, but actually the need isn't as great in that area. So if you were going down a straight impartiality route, you would say the need is greatest here, and this is where we're working, regardless of how it's perceived. So it's just really a question of how does one principle trump another? And if so, which is the trump card, or is it just really about trying to balance them all?
Thank you, appreciate it. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, conversation just makes me think about when neutrality can also pose a threat to an organization, in the sense that, like, for example, you're working in somewhere where there's a civil conflict and one of the rebel leaders is injured and you take care of them and they're wanted by Interpol, and instead of handing them over, you're choosing to be neutral and treat this person. It can create a risk for you in that organization, in that context. Or, for example, when you want to neutrally analyze the threat to your organization from an election, and you want a worst case, best case, medium case scenario. And the reality is that there is a risk from one party who is the incumbent party in a country, and highlighting that information neutrally can also create a risk for you of being surveilled or of being retaliated against by the government in power. So it's just something, a concept that comes to mind.
Yeah, I appreciate
It's
that.
actually something that keeps you safer, or is it something that's linked more to, as they say, professionalism and sensitivity? I think it's like you want to be sensitive to the realities of the situation while also getting your mandate.
Thank you for that. We'll take a moment just to catch some reflections on our speakers here. So quite a few either questions, practical solutions tied to the security lens aspect and some of the prioritization of principle.
No, very briefly, and I start by this impartiality, because impartiality is probably the only principle on which you can have a grip, in the sense that, take the example of a clinic or an office, if it's open to all and it's only needs-based, even if you have only one place in a country, we cannot say it's not impartial, in the sense, it's open to all. You don't make any difference, and and it's needs-based. So I think the fact is there is many misunderstanding about impartiality and neutrality. And it starts again by in the heads of civilians per se. And I mentioned the elements I mentioned at the beginning with the judge, that's the reality. And again, when you discuss with an authority, they don't understand our neutrality. They understand it as a way to criticize them at the end of the day, So I think, but that's where the grip around impartiality is central from my point of view. The second, what you said, I totally agree, and it reminds me this tragedy of MSF Kunduz Hospital in 2015 that has been bombed by the US Army, and where I was still MSF at the time, and when we went to discuss at Washington, DC about it, the first reaction by them was not to apologize, it was to say, we're going to pay for the families that have lost relatives. But they wanted to tell us, we prefer to support Ghani regime because they were so afraid that you were treating Taliban, more than to say we did a big mistakes.
And the example that I was drawing from was actually MSF and Chad.
Yeah, and I could have taken Chad and other places, but it's true, this this notion of how your willingness to be impartial, and it's more to be impartial than to be neutral again, because it creates some neutrality perception unneutrality perception. And that's where I'm still convinced today that the humanitarian sector is seen as everything but not neutral, for sure, for many reasons. But I have to say, there is for me a strong responsibility by humanitarian leaders. And it's interesting to see in this fora, there's no humanitarian decision makers coming here this week. Sorry to say, guys, we are all equal hands. The top guys who go to Doha, who discuss with Ben Salman Institute, who discuss with autocratic regime presidents, they are not coming here at HMNBU to confront the a bit controversies, you know. And for me, and I remember this anecdote I mentioned to you, Cameroon, and the fact we were sad to see that the humanitarian coordinator, this Italian lady, has been persona non grata, and they put someone else. And this guy said, "Oh, my objective is to restore the relationship with your friends." And he started to play golf with the Minister of Interior on a weekly basis. What image you give in terms of neutrality or humanitarian principles when you start to do this type of thing? So I'm still believing that our political leaders are condemning authorities when they are in Brussels, London, in huge conferences abroad, but they are not really tackling the issues and taking the arm of guys and pushing more. So I think there it's central. And I would go more than this with a donor example, because when we think about giving up, as you said, the giving up. In my experience at the field recently, I've seen only one international organization that decided to giving up. It's CARE International, that gave some programs that contrary to the keys to localize. But I never seen another one, but perhaps you give me examples. But again,
Which country?
Cameroon again. Cameroon. But the way also the donors are organizing things, and they want to consolidate, they want to support. That's why also H2H network exists. They say, oh, we don't want to give 200,000 to a small organization. We give it to you, and after you manage with them. You know, the fact, all of this reality of donors facilitation of life, you know, have consequences of how you can really implement humanitarian programming and also implement humanitarian principles. You know, that's a consequence. So I think it's important to look at that as well as a refugee.
No, just a very small note to pick up on that. One thing that came out of the research was the question of, are organizations really, quote, localizing, or are they decentralizing their operations and opening up smaller sort of offices in orbit that are a mix of maybe expat staff and resident staff, but is that really localization? What are the implications in terms of the footprint of that organization there? And I'll just add one other comment from someone who was leading a local NGO in one of these areas about the consequences of that for poaching essentially national staff members from these national organizations that are quite robust and that are really working and have been working for a long time, but that simply can't match, frankly, some of the salary or some of the other kinds of things that these decentralized or satellite, maybe we can call offices of these larger organizations. And furthermore, that they might even be creating competition among local NGOs because they're trying to recruit staff, consultants, things like this, and ultimately being a disruptor in the space where they're creating this gravity toward larger organizations despite their hope to localize. So it's kind of a tension there that we also saw in the research.
Thank you, Anaid. I realize we have about 15 minutes left, so I just want to focus a little bit more on the security neutrality bit and looking at the kind of partnership modalities that play into this, how to effectively address disparities in security support and risk management between international and local staff. So I want to ask, you know, obviously, what are the consequences of this and how can we approach improving this, resolving these issues? But yeah, I saw you did have your hand up earlier.
I did. So I guess under the lens of localization.
Yes.
Because it's one thing under the lens of neutrality, because it's one thing to talk about
localization,
how we empower local actors to perform their obligations vis-a-vis the SRM function. It's a different thing under the principle of neutrality. So I have a few thoughts, Dimitri, and I hope I'm staying in the topic. So again, going back to the initial statement, when does really neutrality matters? Neutrality matters in the case of armed conflict. It doesn't really matter when you respond to a typhoon in a relatively stable green type of environment. So the question to ask is, are local NGOs really fit for purpose in situations of armed conflict? Are they really fit for purpose? So again, for me, it's about the codification of the type of conflict. And if neutrality really matters in that case, then in my view, again, we are transferring the risk. So by choosing a national partner from a security risk management perspective, just to connect the dots, what we do is we transfer the risk with the expectation that those national partners will remain neutral to the response. And having been a national country director in a non-conflict environment, I cannot even imagine myself as a national a leader working in an armed conflict. The amount of pressure you receive from the government, because everybody has your number, is immense. So we need to ask again, go back to the very basic question, are local NGOs fit for purpose in situations of armed conflict? Again, for me, the answer, just to conclude and summarize, it depends on the type of the conflict.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Are there any immediate reactions to this or to the question I posed earlier, connecting security and neutrality? Yes, please go on.
What I'm hearing like repeatedly is that it's significantly different when you're dealing with a civil conflict with a government involved. Because they're the ones who are able to take your neutrality and use it as a political football for themselves. That's the question.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Thank you. Anyone else? I see. Did you
Maybe.
motion it?
Yeah, maybe to add to that as well, it's like I'm kind of talking a bit to the bigger way that the humanitarian system is structured, particularly from the UN side, where it is focused on member states. Like you have to operate with the permission of the host government, but you're also funded by member states, particularly when then there are actors in a conflict which aren't a state or a recognized state. How is that kind of bring up issues with neutrality?
I appreciate that. Thank you. I see another person.
I would like to ask Panos if in this fit for purpose local or national organizations thing, there is a question about access. Like, does it has an impact on the access and on the operational capacities to respond to what is going on in these cases?
Well, if you're able to maintain your neutrality, I guess you have no benefit from an access perspective. So one will cancel the other. Because as a national partner, if you're not neutral, then what's the benefit? What do you really bring to the table? Why should I go to you? Let's be blunt, because it's one thing to say, oh, I really support localization. I do, not everywhere.
Bold statement. Yeah, are there any thoughts?
Yeah, perhaps 3, 4, 5 important concluding remarks because time's running, but I have to say I a bit disagree about what you say about not really using the humanitarian principles in natural catastrophe environment, because first of all, I think it's in any place where humanitarian organizations operate, you need to practice humanitarian principle, first of all. And we should not underestimate as well the number of dilemmas and complexities in terms of negotiation with authorities, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, Interior, in a natural catastrophe response, where if we do not apply any principles, my goodness, we're going to be in trouble. So I think for me, humanitarian principles is really a vehicle to work, you know, and we should use it as a vehicle on a very pragmatic manner and adapt us on the best way we can. The second thing is concluding remark. I don't think it's going to be enough to create a local NGO forum to support localization ambition, locally led programs, as we discussed since the Grand Bergen Istanbul story almost 10 years ago. I think, and particularly if we want to engage NGOs in principles approach, and there I see two different dimensions where international actors, and I would say UN agencies and international organizations, NGOs have a major responsibility. First, to better and strongly advocate with regards political leaders and humanitarian decision makers on their own role and responsibilities on it, and including donors. I think still humanitarian actors are very individualistic, working on silos, competing, and with very unusual collective reflection about how they participate to this mess, on one and another, and particularly putting under pressure on local actors. So very still to happen, and I don't see that, and I'm not very optimistic when I see the way, for example, in an Ukraine crisis, this arrival of international actors and international staff, while creating a kind of parallel reality with national society. Because in Ukraine, there are amazing national people in terms of civil societies and NGOs, and they receive scraps in comparison to 600 staff that arrive in Kiev in 6 weeks, and like international staff. And it's amazing that we have been able to create a kind of parallel system today in Ukraine. Big cascade money in the humanitarian sector, and local NGOs that were there since decades and trying to beg to have 100,000, So I think there is a huge responsibility. And the last thing I would like to say is probably in the reflection of the future of humanitarian enterprise, and we can perhaps change a bit. There is one element on civilian aspiration on which we remain as a collective group extremely restrictive, and probably that it's where we do not create more adhesions. Let's be fair as well on the fact that people on the ground in universities, even in conflict settings, they don't see humanitarian activities as a future stuff. They see more other things. Talking about intelligence, artificial, talking about access to jobs, justice, blogging with friends, etc., and business models. People, they want to gain money. And they see the sector as a sector that has been extremely rich and gaining money. And since I'm evolving in this sector, I'm amazed, even MSF bought a building, in Manhattan, for 25 million, let's be honest. And all the enterprise has been extremely healthy. In the meantime, civilians on the ground, they don't see major things alongside the assistance provided. So I think there is major reflections to bring, and if we want to convey humanitarian principles, we need as well to reflect about our business model and how this business model is paralyzing as well new opportunities and new ways of engaging in the humanitarian field.
Thank you, Manuel, for your closing remarks. Anait, do you have any?
Not much more to add, because I think that was very helpful. I would just, one last point I think that came out is this notion of the pressure on civil society organizations and national NGOs, particularly because their very presence and the very presence of the international sector humanitarian actors on the ground, and also national actors, highlights the deficiencies oftentimes of the functioning of the state, the presence, the services, and so forth. And so I think just to say that shouldn't be underestimated in the ways in which national NGOs are forced to operate and are pressured to operate, and what can be expected of their role in given spaces, and the ways in which international organizations can support them and not further exacerbating the burden of risk that is already posed onto their shoulders in these contexts. Thank you all for the conversation.
Thank you, Anait. I welcome any other statements that people make. No questions, we can always have more, but if there are any other statements, please feel free to jump in. Please go ahead.
Just a tale from the field. So my last humanitarian position was in Poland in 2022, and we had some Ukrainian refugees working on the Ukrainian response for the Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And one of my colleagues, he refused to talk in Russian to another Ukrainian person, and we ended up having to explain neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And we had, this is in connection also with the question Maureen was asking, and we had to explain that if there were some Russian people, we will help them as well. So what you were saying, Manuel, around the perception that we have as being neutral is not even always clear for our own employees on what it represents. So we had to tell them, no, you have to speak in Russian to any beneficiaries. If you can speak even in Russian, if the person speaks only Russian, you have to do it. And it doesn't matter what are your personal opinions. You are free. I didn't say it. I didn't say you are free to walk away, but basically it's a choice. If you're working with this organization in these circumstances, these are things that are going to happen, and you're going to have to make hard calls.
Thank you. It actually goes back to some of the conversation around the social media and trying to get everybody aligned, and it's complicated, definitely for sure. All right, in that case, we just have a couple minutes left. I just want to thank you all for taking part in this conversation. It's kind of hard to talk about some of these major pillars without just getting really deep into one and forgetting the others. So this is why we're trying to figure out this interplay, because there's quite a bit to unpack on each of these different pillars. The report is still in progress, and we'll definitely make sure to share it with all of you. If you haven't already registered for the session, please feel free to reach out to any of my colleagues here so we make sure we can share the report when it's finalized with all of you. But otherwise, thank you for your participation, and hope you have a good rest of your conference. Thank you.
Yeah, really.
Wow, yeah.